Military policy of the day to keep the sick in hospitals near the battlefields, because the officers were fearful that if a sick soldier were furloughed, he would not return to his regiment. Mrs. Harvey thought just the opposite. In her opinion, if the sick were sent home to northern air to recuperate, they would recover more quickly and be able and willing to return to their unit. She launched a campaign to have hospitals constructed in Wisconsin. But her efforts were futile. She finally decided that she must go to Washington herself to see the highest power, the Commander-in-Chief, President Lincoln.
When I first saw him, his head was bent forward, his chin resting on his breast, and in his hand was a letter which I had just sent in to him. He raised his eyes and said, "Mrs. Harvey?" I hastened forward and said, "Yes, Mr. Lincoln, and I am glad to see you." He took my hand, hoped I was well, but there was no smile of welcome on his face. Rather, it was the stern look of a judge who had decided against me. "Madam, this idea of northern hospitals has been talked of a great deal, and I thought it was settled, but it seems not. What have you got to say about it?" I replied, "Only this, Mr. Lincoln, that there are many thousands of graves along the rivers and in the swamps for which the government is responsible. Ignorantly, undoubtedly, but this ignorance must not continue. If you will permit these men to be sent north, you will have 10 men where you have 1 now." The president responded with the standard official government opinion that sick soldiers sent north would desert. I simply said, "Dead men cannot fight. But if the sick ones are sent north, they will recover and they may not desert."
The argument ran on and on. Lincoln sent her to see the Secretary of War with these words written on the back of her letter: "Admit Mrs. Harvey at once. Listen to what she says. She is a lady of intelligence and she talks sense." Predictably, her meeting with Secretary Stanton produced little, and she returned the next day to see the president. He was in no better mood. President Lincoln opened the conversation with, "I believe this idea of northern hospitals is a great humbug, and I am tired of hearing about it."
I said I regretted adding a feather's weight to his already overwhelming care and responsibilities. I suggested I would rather have stayed at home. Mr. Lincoln said he allowed that he wished I would. But I told him I came to him because I had firsthand knowledge of the soldier's situation, because I knew what he could not know. He said I assumed to know more than his surgeons and his generals. I assured him I intended no disrespect, but I let him know that I came to him from no casual inspection tour, rushing through hospitals with a cigar in my mouth, but rather from spending long days and nights beside the cots of young men who died, who might have lived if they'd been in northern hospitals. This was difficult to say, but nonetheless true.
Cordelia left with the understanding that she would return the next day at noon. She waited for 3 hours while the president was in a cabinet meeting, certain that her mission would fail. Finally, he appeared and apologized for having kept her waiting. This day, his opening statement carried a very different message. "Mrs. Harvey," said the president, "I only wish to tell you that an order granting a hospital in your state has been issued." Mrs. Harvey wept for joy.
He asked that I return on the morrow to receive a copy of the order. I did so, and it was ready as promised. Then Mr. Lincoln asked me a strange question. He said, "Mrs. Harvey, would you have been mad if I'd said no?" I thought for a moment and said, "No, Mr. Lincoln, I should not have been angry. To get angry, you know, would weaken my cause and destroy my influence." He then said, "Well, what would you have done if I'd said no?" I didn't have to think about that one. I just said I'd have been here at 9 in the morning to press my case. At that point, I believe Mr. Lincoln was convinced he had made a wise decision.
Lincoln suggested naming the hospital for Cordelia, but she demurred, requesting that it be named for her husband. As a result of Cordelia's meetings with President Lincoln, hospitals were established in Madison, Milwaukee, and Prairie du Chien. After the war, the Harvey Hospital in Madison became a home for veterans' orphans. Cordelia Harvey was certainly one of the most famous of Wisconsin's women, a national figure, one of the great Army nurses whose work was not limited by state lines. She was pleasant but firm in the face of the government and the Army. She was unselfish and fully committed to the welfare of the Wisconsin soldier. She truly deserved to be called the Wisconsin Angel.